Right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is now 10 o'clock. I would like to welcome you all to this meeting of the Joint Planning Policy Committee of Torridge and North Devon. We are on YouTube, so bear that in mind. Fairly potentially heavy agenda. When you're using the microphones, please keep close to them, and then people can hear you much better. They do work, but if you sit too far away, they don't work. So there we are. If there is no fire alarm scheduled, so if it goes off, get out, lead the way that way. There's one there. Apologies for absence.
Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor James, and Councillor Leather is substituting.
Right.
Councillor Room as well.
Councillor Room. Yep.
Well, you ain't got much on, have you?
Right. We have the minutes of the 22nd of March. I'll read them by the page number at the bottom. If there's something wrong, shout. Page 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Are we all happy with these, that they can be signed? Please show if you are. Oh.
Yeah.
Need to proposal, Councillor Bell, thank you. Seconder. Councillor Walker, my apologies. All in favour, please show. Oh, not quite unanimous, have to count.
'Tis now.
9, I make it. Against? Abstentions? 1. Thank you. And then I have some minutes. No, I don't. I was 2 copies of the same thing. We move on next to the next item on the agenda, which is forward plan on page 11. Which is empty because they haven't worked out yet what we are going to be doing, but we shall sort it out hopefully eventually. Item 4, agreement of the agenda between parts 1 and 2. There's nothing proposed for parts 2. Item 5, declarations of interest. You all know the score, but for the benefit of members of the public, if members here have a personal or financial interest in anything that's being discussed, they have to declare it and potentially leave the room. They certainly can't vote. Item 6, items brought forward by the chair. I have none, so I can get on to item 7. The response prepared by the officers to the government consultation on the proposed reforms to the National Planning Policy Framework. There are 100 and something things in it. Bear in mind that North Devon voted Liberal and Torridge voted Conservative at the last election. We now have a Labour government, so it's likely they will do that which they want to do rather than take any notice of what we say, but we can at least try. But please don't keep interrupting to say, yes, I'm in favour of this. We need to move on. There's an awful lot of questions to be dealt with. It's going to be dealt with. The officer dealing is Ian Rowland of Torridge.
Good morning. Good morning, members. Thank you, Chair. So yeah, it was going to be a bit of a double act with Elizabeth Dee and myself. Unfortunately, she's unable to be here today. I would point out that the response has been prepared by a multitude of officers across both councils, bringing in specialists as well, such as our climate change officer and affordable housing officers, where that's been necessary and appropriate to the specific questions. So if I don't have the specific detail in terms of an individual answer, there are 106 of them, so please do bear with me if you have any particular questions that I have to look up, but we will certainly try our best. I'm not intending to go through question by question, all 106 questions, you'll be pleased to know, because we would be here for the rest of the weekend, and certainly I don't think that's beneficial to any of us in terms of doing it in that detail. So I think it's worth pointing out the new government has committed to whole-scale planning reform and has committed to implementing the new plan-making regime that was put forward by the previous government under the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. So they've committed to the principles of that. And they've also committed to an increase in housing numbers to 370,000 per year, or 1.5 million over the parliamentary period. So those more astute will realise that 370,000 per year adds up to more than 1.5 million over the 5 years, and that's on the basis that they expect under-delivery of that number in reality. So they feel that there's a need to plan for more so that you deliver the appropriate amount. Now, there are issues that are associated to that, particularly around how you then underperform against housing targets and how local authorities can be penalised, but we'll come on to that. But I thought that was a useful little bit of context. So the consultation closes on September the 24th, so we've got until Tuesday next week to submit this response. It is in draft, and the idea of today is to sense check that, to get any views or any amendments we need to make to it, which we will then look to make. We hopefully will get endorsement from yourselves to submit it subject to those amendments, and then officers will arrange for that to be updated and submitted by the close of Tuesday. So the consultation itself covers a wide scale of changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, but also other changes to the planning system. A significant one is to the standard method for establishing our housing need or our housing targets for our local plan for the area. With big changes there and big consequences potentially. And then a range of other operational aspects of the planning system. Planning fees, and at that point I'll bring in Helen. And then also local plan intervention criteria, which is the kind of catch-all worst case scenario of needing the Secretary of State to intervene in your plan making. And then some changes around the nationally significant infrastructure project regime, around cost recovery for that, and also what projects would go to that rather than being determined as planning applications locally. I'm going to start with the changes to the standard method, as we feel that they're probably the ones that have got the biggest significance and consequence to us as a local authority. They're looking at changing it quite significantly. It's the method, it's the formula that's used to calculate what our starting point is for working out our housing requirements in our local plan. Our existing local plan didn't have to conform to this approach, didn't use that formula. It was prepared before this came in. So there's a formula at the moment that's in place that we would be having to follow when we're preparing a new local plan in terms of calculating that housing number for our area. So they're looking at making some significant changes to that, which have a significant impact on the overall outcome for a lot of authorities. So I'll go through the particular changes to the formula, and then we'll have a look at what the outcomes of that are. Changes to the baseline need from using household projections, which they've been doing. They've been using the 2014 household projections, which are a proxy for future household growth. We know that they have some issues. It bakes in previous trends. So if you've delivered less housing in the past, then you'll probably have less projected through the household projections. But there is a proxy there for need, because it does take into account births, deaths, migration, etc. And they're proposing to change that to a simple proportion of your housing stock. So it's a flat line growth as a percentage of what stock you've got in an area. So it becomes more equitable in terms of that. Bigger the place, the more housing that you need to deliver, but it decouples that relationship with need. So there's no connection to need or to ambition or to what your growth potential is, or where you may be seeing more migration or effectively more pressure for housing. Second element that they're looking at is increasing the impact of the affordability on the uplift. So there's an element of the formula that says, okay, once you've got that baseline, we look at how affordable housing is in your area, and the less affordable it is, the more we increase that number for your area. Now, we have quite a high affordability ratio. It's around about 10, so that's a ratio of the amount of household income to house prices. So house prices are, the average is 10 times the average household income. So they're looking at increasing the emphasis on that aspect of it quite significantly, and that has a big bearing on our housing numbers here locally of what comes out of that formula. Now, we have real concerns with that, and I'll come on to the concerns we're looking to raise through the response shortly. I'll go through the aspects first. They're looking at removing an urban uplift, it's called, which was applied to the 20 largest urban areas in the UK. They were given a chunk of housing on top of their number to increase it further. They're looking to remove that. That was on the basis that they're the most sustainable locations that are likely to be able to accommodate growth and be able to pursue better economic growth. They're looking to remove a cap. So there was a safety net in the formula that looked against your existing housing requirements and then capped what that increase might be, so that you didn't have a shock loading on the local area of a significant dramatic increase on that housing number when you have to move from one plan to another. It was intended to allow for a gradual increase, still quite significant, but a more gradual increase over time. They're looking to remove that so that all authorities would get the full impact of that standard method formula, irrespective of what you've planned for before. So we have some real concerns around all of those aspects. We raise those through the responses to the various questions. They ask about each of those elements. We raise that concern around moving to the housing stock and that decoupling of that need, in that it's not then any relationship to need itself, and actually it's just a proportion. It doesn't take account of what your area should be looking to grow on the basis of what your local demographic requires. The affordability uplift we feel is unreasonable in terms of its level of impact on the formula, recognising that actually locally affordability isn't just impacted by the amount of houses you build. Simply increasing your housing target is not going to address housing affordability. We raise the point that actually dealing with household income, working on our economy is an important aspect that we need to address in terms of housing affordability, that we need to work on affordable housing delivery, and that just simply looking at increasing the number, particularly to an undeliverable requirement, which we believe it is not going to look to deliver for us. We're still going to have those that are more wealthy being able to move into the area and outpricing locals in terms of the housing stock and the affordability of the housing market, and also recognising that the market is not going to allow house prices to fall in the way that this is assumed to actually operate and deliver improved affordability. So we have real concerns of that assumption that just delivering more housing is, in terms of a requirement, is going to deliver improvements in affordability. So we raise those points. The removal of the urban uplift, it doesn't affect us directly, but we're concerned that that then disproportionately distributes the housing to less sustainable areas and has that impact, which again directly relates to us in terms of increasing our housing requirements. Similar with the removal of the cap, you'll see that the numbers are actually very significant in terms of their increases for North Devon and Torridge and across the combined Northern Devon area. We feel that there should be that tempering of that increase as it's not realistic to suddenly push up that number. So we make all of those points through the response. The consequence for Northern Devon is shown in that table there. They're the existing standard method requirements per annum, so the number of dwellings For North Devon, it was going to be 323, and for Torridge, 391, making a requirement for our new local plan as a baseline, as we were assuming, of 714 dwellings per year, slightly below what we've actually got in our existing local plan. But then on top of that, you can start to put things like your ambition for economic growth and have regard to that, for example. And if you've got ambitions to deliver more affordable housing, etc. The proposed numbers are starkly higher, 779 per annum for North Devon, 528 for Torridge, and 1,307 in total for Northern Devon. That's a figure we've never got anywhere near in terms of delivery across the two local authorities, as far back as our records go, sort of 20 or so years, if not longer. 141% increase for North Devon, 35 for Torridge, and 83 overall. And it does show across the standard method, if you look at across the UK, there's a reduction in the numbers going to London authorities, and a disproportionate increase to rural areas that have small or no urban areas within them. So it's a change of emphasis in terms of where that housing gets distributed nationally. Just a chart to show the difference there. The purple line across the chart shows where our existing local plan requirement is. The green bars are for North Devon, the blue bars are Torridge, and the grey bars are Northern Devon. The second set of bars from the left is the current standard method. It just shows it quite well. And the third set of bars along are the new proposed method. So you can see a stark increase in terms of the housing requirements over a 20-year plan period. If we're talking that, we're talking 26,000 homes we'd need to be planning for versus 17,000 in our existing local plan, or actually only 14,000 under the standard method as it stands at the moment. So we've raised significant concerns, which hopefully members will be supportive of, around those numbers. We recognise the need to deliver housing and the need to plan for that, and we're supportive of that, and we're supportive of having a method for doing so. But we raise our concerns around the achievability of those numbers that come out of it, and also raise concerns around the actual methodology and the fairness of that methodology. Joe, I don't know if you want to take questions on different sections as we go, or if there's any comments members would like to make at this point around that section before we move on to another element of it.
We certainly can do. I think I'm just looking at people who are appalled with what they're reading, but having said that, anyone? Yes, Councillor Walker. The green one.
Right, it's the mic and then it turns on. What happens to the housing that is already allocated that hasn't been built in these numbers? Can that be included in these numbers?
Yes, it can. Well, yes, in theory. Depends on the starting point of our new local plan. So we can use any supply that would be unbuilt as of the start of a new local plan. So if we were starting with a date of, say, 2028, 2026, 2025, 2026, say, as an example, then any housing that's outstanding, that's got planning permission or allocations that we carry forward, we would be able to count those towards the numbers as long as they're not completed at that point in time.
Can I ask Chair? Sorry, one mic. Can I ask Ian? I understand. I mean, we're always surprised that before the housing, I think the housing evidence in the last local plan showed a greater demand in Torridge than in North Devon. And these figures are showing the emphasis very much the other way round. What part of the work or the algorithm has produced such a difference between North Devon and Torridge?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Prowse. So the difference there in terms of the flip around between North Devon and Torridge is very much on that basis of that previous household projections versus the housing stock in the formula. So North Devon has a proportionally higher housing stock, so therefore the new method takes account of that. Historically, there was some lower levels of delivery were baked into the household projections for North Devon. And that's where I was saying actually previous delivery over the last 20 years has an impact then on the household projections for the future. Torridge proportionally had seen quite relatively high level of growth in terms of housing stock over that period where those household projections come in, and it then tracks that forward. So even though North Devon's got I think 50% higher population, one would assume there's a higher need. The previous formula didn't take that into account. So there is a logic to the way that it's rebalanced, and I think all of us would see that makes sense when you look at the numbers that a larger population would require a slightly higher level of housing in the future. But that's the reason.
Could I just follow that up, Jack? So presumably going forward, though, as we've agreed to do a joint local plan, what impact will that ratio have in how we go ahead with the HELA, for instance, and decide on new towns, urban extensions, growth to local centres and bigger villages? Is it in our hands completely, or are you saying that we've got to look at that balance within the work that we're about to start?
So I think the starting point is to understand what the need is for each of those local authorities in terms of the number. I say need, the proxy for need, the requirement. As I think I've mentioned, I don't believe that it now has really a relationship to need. I think the starting point is to look at those numbers across the two authorities. But the benefit of doing a local plan across an area like Northern Devon is that we can look at what's best for the area. We don't have to fix those numbers within the two individual authorities. We can look at what's the best route for delivery across the two authorities for there. The previous local plan, for example, looked at delivering more growth in and around Bideford as a rebalance to the sub-regional centre to make it more self-contained. And that was something that we looked at quite heavily as something we wanted to deliver, and we saw the logic in that, particularly with the amount of commuting that was happening between the two places. So it's within your gift to look at that as we develop the plan, and there's some difficult decisions there, I'm sure, but we have that ability to look at how we would distribute that housing across Northern Devon.
Councillor Coddle-Hunkin.
Yeah, I just think the numbers are ridiculous. Can we send that message back? Because the impact it will have on our rural area is significant. 1,300 new houses every year. We've said it's not deliverable because we haven't got the workforce, I don't imagine, to even build them. But the impact it will have, we're a tourist area and an agricultural area as well, and it will affect both of those things. We haven't got the infrastructure, we haven't got the roads, everything, like the hospitals, the doctors, the dentists, it's completely outrageous. So that's just what I want to say on it.
Councillor Hames. Councillor Bell.
Thank you. I just, if you could explain, we talked about the housing stock, the numbers being based on housing stock, and yet obviously, but then I think you also said the city areas, they're having lower numbers of increase than rural areas like North Devon. It seems that based on housing stock, that I was always worried when I first heard this, that North Devon wouldn't see enough target houses, because I appreciate we are a tourist area and all of those great things, but we're also an area with no houses for people that are born here. Can you explain that to me like I'm a staff nurse or something?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Bell. It's a relative issue. So I say lower numbers, it's proportionately. So we're seeing a proportionate lowering of numbers in London. So there's an uplift for pretty much everybody across the entire country. The uplift is lower for those urban areas because of the impact of these affordability ratios and because of the way the change from household growth. I think the household projections probably around London were significant before in terms of the levels of growth that they indicated. So the formula would have seen that base starting point because of the past trends, seeing a massive increase. We all know how much London has grown over the last 20 years in terms of housing stock, so that would have been baked in. So that the percentage of actual housing stock now just means that the lines are at a slightly different angle. So it redistributes it more to wider areas because those household projections were so stark for areas like London, were much more dramatic in terms of the levels of increase. It's much more tempered and neutralised in terms of using the housing stock. I'm not sure if that explains it really.
No, that's sort of what I imagined, but it's the actual seeing it in black and white didn't quite start. And could I also ask, we are talking again about affordability.
Can you not quite hear me?
No, I can hear you, but
Thank you.
others can't.
Oh, I don't want to be missed out on. Just on the affordability again, I know that we've talked about the median income throughout the document. It seems a slightly poor metric when the median income includes all the people that definitely do not need affordable housing. It includes people that do, very much so, but I think I mentioned in my response that we need to have an affordability calculation based on the people that actually need affordable housing. Clearly, in North Devon, that is we need more affordable housing and we need that housing to be affordable, but we do not need these affordability ratios to be dragged up by the people that come down working from home. Very great. All of the other things, the people living in the larger houses, they simply should not be impacting on the affordability ratio. And the calculations I've seen, they do.
I would agree. Yes, I think median income, as you say, takes in a whole host of people that actually have got quite a significant income and aren't in direct housing need in that sense. I think there's another issue that I didn't touch on that we have raised in the response is around they actually look at workplace-based income rather than residence-based income. So it's taken from where you work rather than from where you live. We feel that actually within a sort of self-contained area such as Northern Devon, it should be on where you live as a use of an income data set. But I absolutely agree. The challenge is the other alternative data sets that used to be available with lower quartile incomes, that is no longer available as I'm aware within the ONS data. So what alternative would be used is a real challenge, but we can certainly add in that aspect, I think, a little bit more strongly.
Yeah, so personally, I'm just concerned where they're going to get all the brickies to build these houses. I've got an awful feeling that once a man knows he holds a trowel by the handle and not the blade, he'll be a qualified brickie. But there we are, move on.
Thank you, Chair. We'll move on to the range of other comments or aspects of national planning policy, and these are more directly to the NPPF itself and changes to the individual paragraphs that they're proposing. A lot of them are to roll back changes that were only made in December 2023 by the then Conservative government, and this looks to effectively remove quite a number of those and revert back to the previous version of the MPPF. But there are some that are of concern, and certainly there are some that actually we will be supportive of as well, I believe. We'll go through them in turn. We've talked about the numbers, but one of the consequences of those higher numbers is potentially undermining the plan-led system by it triggering the presumption in favour of sustainable development, so the tilted balance. So we're all very aware of the issue of the 5-year housing land supply and not being able to show you've got enough land available for housing, and then having to look more favourably on applications for housing in places we wouldn't normally want to see it. So they're not really looking to change the wording of the presumption in favour of sustainable development that much. They're clarifying the policies that would be considered out of date, which would include your housing requirement, though, importantly. And your housing requirement is therefore linked to this big high number of the standard method, and whether that's then considered out of date because it's not in conformity with this new number. So the concern is that in the short term, our housing requirement may be rendered out of date, and therefore we may have to trigger the presumption in favour of sustainable development. We are seeking clarity around that. We're concerned that that undermines the plan-led system. Whilst you're trying to prepare a new plan, whilst you have a plan that yesterday was up to date and robust and delivering growth for your area, and that overnight, with the imposition of a new number, that could change. Now, we don't know that would be the case, and there would be a need to sort of interrogate the wording of that requirement more closely, but we feel it's important to make that point and our real concerns around that. They do introduce some wording around making sure that anything that is subject to the presumption in favour is of a good design, is in a sustainable location, etc., etc. So that is to be welcomed. It's probably not necessary, as you always need to read the MPPF as a whole. So there's other aspects in there already, but we do support that in general. But there's a real concern that will undermine the plan-led system for the entirety, potentially, of the time we would need to take to plan for a new local plan and get that into place. Don't know if we want to take any comments on that at this point, Chair.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you. Just with regards to that, obviously looking at this expansion to the 5-year housing land supply, my biggest fear here, especially since we are going to be caught, I want to say with our pants down, we're going to be caught holding the ball. That sounds better. It's such a blunt instrument. We need a 5-year housing land supply. We've got to have a target imposed. We know that, and we know that's going to happen, and that's probably necessary. But we need a 5-year housing land supply target that looks at every element of our affordable housing. So if you simply say we need to have 15,000 new houses, we need specified that within that 15,000 new houses, or whatever it is to be, X percentage of that, preferably 50%, is social housing and affordable housing. This otherwise is simply not going to work. We are simply going to get bulldozed over, and I know a lot of people aren't in favour of that, I'm not, by probably inappropriate housing. Can we go back in our response and suggest that? Or more than suggest, firmly state, or firmly state?
So, Chair, yeah, I think we can strengthen that element around concerns that it delivers the wrong type of housing and doesn't support the delivery of affordable housing per se. And we have seen that with 5-year housing land supply sites, often coming forward as sites of 4 or 5 houses under thresholds, or around the urban areas under 10, and not then contributing to that affordable housing delivery.
Chair, I agree with Graham. I mean, the reality is that the approach that the right sort of affordable housing can be delivered through development alone has failed, obviously failed. And I think, that's the message we need to put back. It's broader than just tinkering around. Without direct government intervention and funding to produce the old council housing type model, we are going to continue. This sort of process has been around for 20, 25 years now, and it has failed each and every year each and every change to the MPPF, planning guidance and everything else, none of it has made any difference. That in the end, development doesn't deliver the level and the need of affordable housing. And I don't think it ever will. So I just think, you know, it's a two-pronged approach. I'm going to support what Graham is saying. Yeah, we perhaps can tweak it to do a bit better, but it ain't going to solve the problem, and we're still going to be chasing our tails on affordable housing.
Councillor Hodgson.
Thank you, Chair. One of the things that's always concerned me is this criteria for having new development within a community, and the community has got to evidence that it's sustainable. Now, I'm concerned about what criteria is used in our rural settings for actually calling it a sustainable community. Because we all know that through numbers, village schools have closed and people are busing their children to a neighbouring village. Pubs are closing down. Some people don't have village shops any longer. And we have a world in which you can go online and have all your groceries delivered. So if you're on a transport route for Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Asda, whatever, you are getting the benefits of being able to have you. That's the one thing I really think we need to clarify, because to actually say a community is not sustainable because it doesn't have 3 out of 4 of these issues, I think we need to review that. Thank you.
Councillor Walker.
Yeah, I do wonder if we ought to put the infrastructure is the highest need. There's no point in building houses without infrastructure.
Councillor Coddle-Hunkin. No. Right. Councillor Hackett.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to support wholeheartedly what Councillor Hodgson has said, and I would add to the mix internet. If you've got internet, you've got an office wherever you want to work. So I think that becomes part of sustainable development. You know, I am told that areas around Roundswell don't even have superfast broadband and a poor mobile phone signal. So a lot of our villages do. So the whole question of sustainability needs to be put up in the air and re-examined very carefully.
Councillor Walker.
Sorry, as the ward member that covers Roundswell, yes, superfast broadband is now available in the whole of Roundswell. The mobile phone signal is another matter, but that's we do have superfast broadband throughout our ward now.
Councillor Leather.
Yeah, interesting listening to all the comments. I mean, we all know these figures that they're expecting us to produce in the new plan are ridiculous. They're just plucked out of the air, really, not based on anything that the area needs. But I will pick up, I agree with Councillor Walker on the infrastructure. We had always told at planning, when an application comes in, highways are all right, highways are happy. It's not at capacity. Now, yesterday, middle of the afternoon yesterday, the link road from Haywood Roundabout back to the new traffic lights that go into Buckley Road, there was a queue all the way along there. It's not the height of the holiday season. It's not the so-called rush hour when people are coming down from Clovelly Road Industrial Estate down that road. It's just the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Chock-a-block. I think the highways at county seem to think, and I don't think it's going to improve with this Devon and Torbay link up for us, but highways seem to think until everything's jammed up, there's capacity on the network, and there isn't. I mean, it's been mentioned now, look at the rural areas. When were any roads ever widened, improved or built? If we're going to have to apply these figures and try to get anywhere near them, the only way is to build a small new town between Bideford and Barnstable, in my view. And that's the only way you'll get anywhere. And then you're on a reasonable road with the link road and that. But outside of that, we all know in the Barnstable area and Bideford area, the estates that are being built out now, it's causing chaos on the road networks, and it's future chaos that we're building in currently.
Councillor Locke.
Yeah, I completely support what Councillor Hodgson has said about the rural areas. I mean, just because one small hamlet hasn't got 3 out of the 5, a school, a chapel, or you don't even live near a bus stop, one small hamlet can also always support the next one. So I find it very hard when they talk about hamlets and housing is turned down because they haven't not on a bus stop or have to rely on a car. Because even people who live on big estates in town use their car every day to go to school or the shops. So just because you want to live in the countryside doesn't mean to say you've got to live on a bus route.
Councillor Hackett, second time.
Is that a warning?
Yes.
I've got one more strike left, Chair. I think one thing we miss, and I take on board what Councillor Lowe has said, the best road communication we have in Torridge, and we overlook it, is the A30 in my ward. It's not very much of it. It's less than half a mile, I think, in the actual ward itself. But we do need to look beyond Torridge and Northern Devon at what we're building, because very clearly we could take development to the south of my ward, providing the parish councils are happy with it, and we could look very closely at our links to Launceston and Exeter via the A30. And I think we get very, very, very Bideford, Barnstable centric in this committee and in the whole of Torridge. So we have to look with the broader picture. Thank you.
Could be.
You better put your microphone on, but yes, Councillor Hames has suggested building a new town at Borwood Widger.
It used to be a rural district.
Chair, shall I move on?
Yes.
Thank you. So, yep, there is that real concern, and I hear what you've all said, and we'll look to see if we can just tweak the response to have regard to those comments, which are all perfectly valid, I think. I think we do cover quite a lot of those elements. Some of them will be for the new local plan as well, how we look at sustainable development and sustainable places. We can pick that up, I think, through the local plan itself. And questions of where that growth goes, yeah, they're big questions for us outside of this consultation as to how we accommodate whatever the outcome might be. But yeah, really useful stuff. In terms of transport planning, we will come on to that. I can cover it now. They are looking at a move to vision-based transport planning. And that's about what you want to achieve with your transport planning for your local area. It's a local planning authority-led consultation, as it's going to be the NPPF. So that would be about coming up with what you want to achieve with your transport planning, and then, I guess, working with partners to see how that is then delivered. We don't have the detail of that, but there is an element in here that suggests that a move from sort of reactive, responsive, demand-led planning to actually a vision-led planning system for transport. So that's not about getting to a point of critical failure, that's about thinking about where you want to get to instead. So hopefully that may be an improvement, but it needs investment and it needs a lot of other things to make it happen. So 5-year housing land supply, they're looking to reverse a lot of the changes that were made back in 2023. For example, one of them was to remove the requirement to show a 5-year land supply. If you've got a recently adopted local plan, you get a grace period of the 5 years, so that you don't need to do that on an annual basis. It's effectively fixed. They're removing that and reverting back that you have to demonstrate it from the point of adoption all the way through on an annual basis, your 5-year housing land supply. They're looking to add on the buffers again. They removed those. So there would be a requirement for a 5% buffer or a 20% buffer, depending on your performance. 5% would be irrespective of whether or not you're performing well or not. I stated to give choice and competition in the market. They're looking to remove the opportunity to fix it using what was called an annual position statement, although last year only 2 authorities made use of that route. So I don't think there's any concerns really about the loss of that. We do raise concerns around the reintroduction of the buffer, making the point that actually there's buffers baked into the requirements throughout. You have a buffer when we got our housing requirement, our 17,220 in our local plan. That had a buffer to allow for the fact that not all will come forward. There was a buffer in the amount of supply we had to identify within the local plan. We had 20,000 homes available and identified to meet that 17,000 point of adoption. So there's buffers already baked in, so there's that question of whether or not there's a need to have another buffer on top, which makes it more unrealistic that you're ever going to achieve it. And just concerns around the resource impact of having a brand new local plan in place. You're meant to be focusing on the implementation of that plan, and you have to divert resources every year to then deliver that 5-year housing land supply. You could be subject to challenge on that. You could be looking to put resource across to public inquiries, etc. That just doesn't seem just or necessary, and that you're better off focusing that resource elsewhere. If it's a new plan, it's been examined appropriately and prepared appropriately and has been found sound, there should be a period where actually your land supply is given the chance to come on stream and is delivering. Don't know if there's any comments that want to be raised around that. Hopefully that's quite straightforward and you're all relatively supportive of those elements. Brownfield, green belt and grey belt. A lot of that doesn't affect us directly. So we don't have green belt. We're not green belt authorities. None of our surrounding authorities are green belt authorities. So we don't really have responses around the direct impacts of that. What we do raise, though, with some of the Greenbelt is around some of their proposals for bringing in, I guess, benefits for the delivery that are required, golden threads that are required, or they're suggesting are required through Greenbelt development. So if you are going to be releasing Greenbelt land, they're suggesting that that should deliver 50% affordable housing. It should deliver improved green infrastructure for residents, that it should provide better infrastructure. There should be a fixed land value that's taken into account in viability considerations. Now, we question whether or not that should apply to all countryside locations or to AONBs or to anywhere that's in a rural area. Why not introduce that more widely? We feel that actually would help our areas as well as just Greenbelt areas. And get back to that position where actually if you are going to be developing outside of allocations or allocations on greenfield land, that we're getting much more benefit through the planning system in terms of the delivery for affordable housing infrastructure and benefits for our communities. So we raise those points. They're looking at tweaks to the previous definition of previously developed land, around including areas of hard standing and glass houses, horticultural glass houses. Now that's not a big issue for our area in terms of horticultural glass houses. Areas of hard standing, we've raised the fact that they can be in really unsustainable locations in the countryside. And is it appropriate that given their push towards delivery on previously developed land and almost a presumption towards it being suitable for development, they need to make sure that they've thought through the consequences for rural areas and just areas that there are previously developed land in isolated countryside locations. So we raised concerns around that aspect and the losses of those areas of hard standing and areas of glass houses and the pressures that can put on. Not saying we shouldn't see it, but just concerns around that. So they're the real matters that we really raise around greenfield land, greenbelt, previously developed land, etc. One of our members did raise a point in response to the email that went out to all members. Bear with me, I'll just find that. Around the importance of making sure that we consider biodiversity when they're talking about grey belt land. So we can certainly highlight that. Grey belt land wouldn't be directly relevant to us as local planning authorities because that's about lesser quality green belt land effectively. But we can certainly raise that point. And there was also, it was raised that, just clarification that solar PV, battery energy storage should not be considered as previously developed land, particularly where it's a countryside location. So we can certainly look at adding those elements in just for clarification. I don't think they have a significant relevance to it, but certainly they've been raised, and I'm happy to put those into the response. Chair, I don't know if you want to see if there's any questions around green belt, grey belt, previously developed land.
Councillor Bell, I couldn't quite work out whether you wanted to or no.
Thinking, Chair, thank you. It was, I think I may have put into my own response, this definition of green belt land, I worry that this is a slightly London-centric term, that they haven't actually noticed that the South West Peninsula isn't green belt, but that's what they're kind of thinking that's what we are. So whether it would be great to have clarification going forwards here, because I think when they say green belt, they definitely mean the Northern Devon coastline, but they haven't quite noticed that it's not.
I think they're quite clear in terms of what they are looking to apply it to. I think there are some questions of whether it should be wider, as we've said, in terms of some of those provisions around protected landscapes. And there's always been this question and this challenge around, for local planning authorities, around Greenbelt gets all of this protection, very high levels of protection. But actually we have got national landscapes, we have got what were AONBs, that should be protected to the same, if not greater extents, and national parks on our boundaries as well. So I think they are explicit in their understanding of what they're talking about in terms of Greenbelt, I would say, but I do question whether or not there are provisions that should be wider than that, and we do talk a little bit about that, as you'll have seen.
Councillor Hames.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know if it's relevant to us. You mentioned horticulture and glass houses. And yeah, I mean, in terms of future food supplies, we need to protect such sites in terms of developing alternative food supplies, really. Whether that's relevant as a comment, I'm not sure.
Councillor Walker.
Yep, you mentioned that we need to point out that brownfield sites does not include removal of current green energy schemes and things like that. So the solar panels, the solar parks that we've all got in our area. I wonder if you can make sure there's plenty of emphasis put on that, because living near Yellon Power Station, we know that there was an issue with that being allocated as a brownfield site because it had a power station on it, when it really should have been returned to nature after its use.
No one else wanting to speak, so we can move on, Ian.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm hopefully getting through this as quickly as we can. Affordable homes, they are looking at an increase of emphasis on social rented homes, which we really do welcome. Previously, there was a requirement that a proportion had to be affordable homes for rent, affordable homes for sale, for purchase, and that was set at 25%, and we weren't implementing that. We used the exception that was in National Planning Policy, said that if that would prejudice the delivery of homes for a particular part of your community, then you could deviate away from that. But they are looking to remove that now wholesale, recognising that actually that could be a prejudice against the delivery of social rented homes, which for us is our priority and is our highest need. So we welcome that, we support that. We do highlight the challenges that we've had in terms of delivering that percentage in any case of homes for purchase. So I think we're very supportive of that. Another aspect that we do raise is around, they ask questions around how we can support the delivery of affordable housing in rural areas. So we'll all know that we have an exception sites policy. National policy supports the release of land for affordable housing in and around rural areas and villages, etc. But we know that that's not been effective, mainly because of the 5-year housing land supply and the presumption in favour of sustainable development. Now, what we do suggest is that the 5-year housing land supply impacts and the presumption in favour should be removed from those areas that are rural, so that it would increase that likelihood of being able to deliver rural exception sites. So what you would see is we've suggested in places of under 3,000 population, which is a well-used element within national planning policy already for affordable housing thresholds, that you would disapply the presumption in favour of sustainable development, so that actually, hopefully, landowners would be more likely and more willing to give up land for affordable housing exception sites. So getting back to the status quo that we had before the 5-year housing land supply situation was introduced. So, and also affording some of that protection to rural areas. So we raised that. Apart from that, I think we're quite supportive of those changes in terms of towards the bias on social rent, and welcome that. There are some aspects around what else could be done. We say about it's not just planning, but there needs to be good programs of funding and support available to deliver affordable housing. We're certainly seeing challenges with RPs not being able to take on housing stock at the moment because of the funding regime and challenges around that. And the same for community land trusts, etc., making sure there's support and delivery for those in the rural areas too. So, Chair, I'll leave it there for affordable housing.
Councillor Hames.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, there has been some query about the affordable formula based on 80% of prevailing rents, something, whether that should be changed to be more flexible in terms of relating to local incomes or based on residence or whatever you form it. Maybe that's something we could...
Yeah, so locally we do that. So in terms of, we look to two aspects to this. From a rental product, we look to social rent rather than affordable rent. Affordable rent isn't really affordable to our local communities or those most in need. So we look to secure social rented housing, which is proportionate and much lower levels of rent, around 50% of market rents. For discount open markets housing and shared ownership, our existing approach is that we won't accept shared ownership properties where our evidence, it was prepared by a company called Altair, where that shows in particular areas that isn't affordable. We don't allow that to be secured, and we look to discount open market housing. And we have specific discounts for different sizes of housing, which is based on locally derived evidence. And in fact, we just commissioned an update to that now. So we do require quite high levels of discount locally already, and we're able to do that. But that's more of a point of clarification rather than something for the response, probably.
It's 80% in the framework, doesn't it? So that's a fixed, it's not flexible, is it?
No, for affordable rent, that's correct. For social rent, it's at a lower level, but we can certainly raise that.
Yeah. Councillor Locke.
Yeah, you quoted just now 3,000, a population of 3,000, but there's several villages and hamlets with populations of a lot less than 3,000. Is that a set figure, or can that be lowered? Otherwise, smaller places won't be able to be developed.
So we're only talking about suggesting that threshold for where you would disapply the presumption in favour of sustainable development. We're not saying that you wouldn't plan for growth in those places or allow for development or have policies within your local plan that enabled them. What we're saying is that we wouldn't support hostile applications coming forward through a 5-year housing land supply situation in those places. But what that would have the benefit of doing is hopefully engendering support for landowners delivering exception sites. So we can get back to a position where we're delivering affordable housing-led schemes for those places. It's not saying we don't want to grow them, and that's a matter for the local plan. It's about saying we want to plan for that growth and support that growth. What we don't want to see is places being proliferated by 5-year housing land supply type sites, such as we saw with Bradworthy's, for example, is a good example of it. And I know there have been places at North Devon of similar, where we've had application after application after application on the basis of not having a 5-year land supply, not delivering affordable housing for those places, so not meeting the needs of those places. But if we were to disapply that, then we can proactively plan for the housing that those places do want. Does that make sense?
And I think it would, what it would do is enable the exception sites to come forward, because we've seen, well, very few in Torridge, whilst we had a 5-year land supply, because landowners have that greater hope value, and coming forward with an open market scheme is obviously more beneficial. So I think that's what we've really noticed, the impact of the presumption in terms of balance has had on our rural communities.
So why is it necessary to put a figure on that then, 3,000 population?
You'd need to find a threshold somewhere, and that threshold is what's used at the moment for deciding whether the level of 10 dwellings or 5 dwellings is used for the affordable housing. So they're called designated rural areas, and we use them for various things. That threshold for affordable housing on site, and whether we can ask for it. So it's already established as a principle. It's also used to discern between whether or not you can staircase out of affordable housing stock in urban areas versus you have to keep it as affordable housing in perpetuity in rural areas. So it fits neatly with those provisions that are already in place, and is a good threshold really in terms of covering villages versus towns, in terms of where that impact would be.
Right, drive on, Ian. I've got no one else wishing to speak.
So there's a whole section on well-designed places. This does cover things like the word beauty is probably the best way of describing, and the removal of the word beauty from throughout the MPPF is one of the big aspects that they're talking about here. We don't have too much of an issue with that in terms of the word. It was always a little bit concerning that it was an emphasis on just how a place looked rather than how a place functioned. So actually going back to looking at design as a holistic approach, we think is a relatively sensible proposition. I'm not going to go through any more of those aspects in detail. I think we're broadly supportive of most of the design aspects. There are some concerns around upward extensions and moving from identifying a particular type of upward extension, mansard roofs, which was always slightly bizarre in the previous version, to just a broad support for upward extensions in general. We do raise concerns around the importance of having regard to context, having regard to rural areas where that could have a disproportionate impact on local communities. And there's a whole range of things around increasing density as well in terms of the well-designed places. We've raised concerns around that not always being appropriate, that you shouldn't just look at increasing density at all costs, that can have concerns around health and well-being, around the type of place that you make, and about the impact that can have on the future attractiveness of those areas. So we raise all of those points around density and say that it shouldn't be density at all costs and increasing density at all costs. I'll leave the design aspects there, Chair, if there's anyone has any comments.
Oh, Councillor Bell.
I hear increasing irritation every time, Chair. Okay, 2 quick comments. Just on the upward extension, I do agree on this. My biggest worry is that we have estates of bungalows and small houses. Upward extension, it simply over-intensifies the existing properties and creates a situation where, you know, if someone needs to double the height of their houses, they clearly probably need a different house rather than just expanding it. But more importantly, this is the chapter where we talk about the removal of first-time homes and that part of it. What's missing, and I know the Devon Housing Commission moves on to this in its way, is the right sizing of later life homes. And I think this is the area that we need to be readdressing the fact that we have a lot of senior residents who would benefit from having this first-time home sort of placement, and we do see them in Barnstable and Bideford and everywhere, but that being more codified so that they have more opportunity to downsize and right-size their living arrangements, which frees up housing stocks for other families.
Councillor Prowse.
Chair, it is partly about design and density, but it's also really about the environment as well, and it's about how BNG is going to affect all these issues. Talking to developers over the last couple of months, they are really, really struggling with being able to comply with the new regulations on biodiversity net gain. And it's going to mean either us being a little bit more flexible, I don't know how much flexibility we've really got, but in terms of allocation of land, looking at sort of 6-acre fields, you end up with just 30-odd houses because of, if you're trying to do it on site. And so we're not, I mean, I'm not looking for very high densities, but I'm saying we've got to use land properly and efficiently. And, you know, for instance, in my own village in Bratton Fleming, where we're surrounded by Exmoor, and so much biodiversity, we've got it coming out of our ears, you know, to end up having to lose, you know, huge... Sorry. No. Anyway, let's get back to Bratton Fleming. We're not in the national park, but we're yeah.
Carry on, Councillor Crouch.
What I'm saying is that how are we going to respond to allow us more flexibility and persuade the government to tweak the... I'm not against the biodiversity, you know, being a compulsory situation, but to insist that you've got to look first at producing it on site is going to actually muck up allocations and all sorts of other things. So it's a problem about density, it's a problem about how we respect, especially in, you know, say in rural areas, that people think we're a bit daft asking for it when we've got sort of so much countryside on our doorstep.
Yeah, I'll have a think about how we can incorporate that into the response. I think it's probably slightly challenging to get that into where we are at the moment, but I do take your point, and I think we do have to get away from the fact that high density doesn't necessarily mean poor development, and that if you look at a lot of villages, etc., they are relatively high density. It's a different form of housing. We've got to this whole view of semi-detached and detached houses being the right form for delivery. Actually, going back to terrace housing increases density, is very attractive. There's ways that we can increase density and still have regard to character. So there is some merit in it of using, like you say, using land efficiently, I think is a key message that we are supportive of.
Sorry,
Councillor Hames.
I'm a bit concerned about this. Yeah, I mean, on design, there's plenty of scope, as Ian says, for terraces and also bringing squares back as, you know, as another method of designing houses. But I'm concerned about the comments about biodiversity. Again, it's a matter of design. You can incorporate hedges, you can incorporate trees, and doesn't necessarily compromise density or the amount of housing you can put on land. And to say that the countryside is incredibly biodiverse is just wrong. We have one of the worst records of biodiversity in the world. So saying, you know, and gardens are highly important for biodiversity in that context. So I'm a bit concerned about that.
Just to probably temper this entire conversation around BNG, I don't think that the consultation gives us much scope anyway to raise that. I think that's probably a matter that we would need to do outside of the scope of this consultation, Chair.
The only point, Chair, I was trying to make is it's going to have a huge impact on the allocation of land.
Yeah.
And how it is quite a huge percentage of the land. You know, and picking up Peter Haynes' point, I mean, you know, if that is the case, that you know, we're biodiversity short, then you know, then let's do something with the land, but don't do it in development land. Do it in the land outside of the villages and outside of the towns. That's just the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, yeah, and I absolutely agree. I think certainly through the local plan, we will have to look at what the consequences of BNG on the amount of land that we would need to allocate.
You can't keep on, you know, what's the word, putting the biodiversity on other areas of land because you're going to run out of it eventually. You need good design, well-designed developments which incorporate, you know, biodiversity, trees, hedges, everything else. And that adds to healthy living as well, doesn't it? It creates a whole area which people like to live in.
Wish it was that simple.
And you end up like we are in Buckland Brewer with 4 playing fields now, 3 of them that nobody wants to cut, but they've got to be cut and sorted out. Councillor Hodson.
Thank you. I'm moving away from, not that it's not important, and I understand the biodiversity discussion. My concern is about well-designed places and meeting the needs of our communities, and the growing demand for single-person accommodation that is now outstripping the need for family housing with regard to affordability. The other thing that I'd like to look at is there seems to be an emphasis on our ageing population, of which I am one, about where I'm going to live in the future. And somebody said about the proliferation of one-bed bungalows. That's not necessarily the answer, but the potential for retirement villages and the development of those. We have some in the area where you have accommodation that is supported if you need it, and then if your health conditions deteriorate, you can move into the on-site nursing home. And you have all those facilities built into the scheme, so you can live independently for as long as possible. Now, for me, that would be better than, you know, trying and struggling to get care, perhaps where I was living, because we have a shortage of carers. So we've got to start thinking about alternatives for different groups. And into that mix comes the issue of supported housing for young people, for people who are vulnerable adults, for other issues. So, and nobody seems to be, if we're designing places and communities and villages, we need to look at the whole need of that community. Sorry, I think I probably jumped down 2 places on your list.
Councillor Hackett.
See if this resonates with councillors around the room. I know we live in an open market, free market economy, but in a lot of rural villages, a lot of the larger housing stock is bought up by people, affluent people, moving down from the home counties, retiring. They want to come down, separate bedrooms, hobbies room, second bedroom, third bedroom, fourth bedroom for the kids and grandkids. They're the first people to say, we want these villages kept as they are. They don't want additional development in these villages. And the young people that are brought up in the villages can't afford to move on to the bigger houses. I see people nodding around this room, and I've experienced it all too often. What are we to do?
I think the answer is we need a mix, because an awful lot of people who are able-bodied looking to retire want a bungalow, but they want a 2-bedroom bungalow. Ask the estate agents, they'll tell you it's what they can't get enough of, 2- and 3-bed bungalows. And yet they take up too much ground. Councillor Locke.
I'll say this rather cynically, but the first bullet point up there, planning for the homes we need, is entirely different to what the thresholds we're being told to meet. And I agree with Councillor Hackett. We've got to build what we need, not what we're being targeted for.
Hear, hear.
Councillor Hodgson.
Right, just a quick comment to your 2- and 3-bed needs for older people. I quite agree with you. However, the solution can be that we build appropriately designed housing, so you have floor ceiling lifts, so you can access your bedrooms. You don't have to have a bungalow. If you've got a suitably adapted property that is lifetime occupation standards, then you resolve that issue of more land to build a bungalow.
Yes, Councillor Walker.
Yeah, I totally agree with Councillor Hodgson that there are other ways of getting around the bungalow issue. You don't, in this day and age, we don't need bungalows for people to live in adapted accommodation. And the population that are moving down who want bungalows, maybe we should be trying to encourage them to move into houses which have can be, and don't necessarily have to be straight away, but are designed in such a way that you can adapt them in the future.
No one else wishing to speak? Drive on, Ian.
Thank you, Chair. So the next section is around building infrastructure to grow the economy. So the government is looking at introducing specific wording within the NPPF for modern types of uses, such as laboratories, gigafactories, data centres, digital infrastructure, freight and logistics, and having support for those, and that we should be identifying sites for those. We do highlight that those are not such significant aspects for our local economies at the moment, but that we recognise the need to plan for all types of employment. We are concerned around the kind of the wording they use at sort of increasing or adjusting the planning balance around those uses above all other uses, or above other protections that may be within the plan, and we suggest you just need to read the plan as a whole, and you should just put that into the planning balance around those uses. So that's a brief summary of that. I don't think there's anything of real concern in there that for us as a local area. We obviously want to be supportive of moving to a modern economy, and where those opportunities do arise, we want to make sure that we're able to support them. And recognise that, but as I say, we just wanted to make sure that it's not at all costs that those are supported. They do also talk about some of those uses coming under the nationally significant infrastructure regime as well, and I think what the points we raise is that should depend upon the scale of the proposal. It's important that for locally important proposals, they are considered at a local level. Where it becomes more nationally significant, and getting the threshold is correct is really important there. That we don't undermine local democracy, but do recognise that there are some that will be of a higher scale that should be considered possibly elsewhere. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Drive on.
In terms of delivering community needs, we have talked a little bit about this. There's some aspects around community land trusts in there. There's aspects around infrastructure in there that we've talked about, and the need to make sure that we deliver infrastructure as well. I think we've probably covered that off quite nicely already in terms of the discussion that's been held, so I don't think we need to go into any more detail, unless anyone's got some comments they wish to raise.
I thought I was going to say drive on, but there is one woken up. Councillor Hackett.
2 words, self-build. We need to make good provision of sites for self-build.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a few park queues about.
Yes, yeah.
They're unaffordable.
Yeah, we are finding we're getting a lot more information provided about self-build since some BNG exemptions have been introduced around that. So moving on, green energy and the environment. So one of the biggest changes is to regularise the enablement of onshore wind back into the planning system. So that was reintroduced soon after the government came in through a written ministerial statement that removed some of the footnotes in the NPPF to allow applications for wind energy development to be considered again. Effectively, there was a moratorium on those under the previous government because of the prescription of some of the requirements in the NPPF. So the consultation looks to regularise that and support the onshore wind. It does also ask questions around the nationally significant infrastructure project thresholds for solar PV and for wind energy. So in stating a threshold for wind energy, they suggested 150 megawatts. Now, we're suggesting that that may be a little high and that we should have local consideration, or we think we should have local consideration up to around maybe 100 megawatts. And they're also suggesting that with solar PV, solar farms, that the threshold was increased up to 150 megawatts there. So we look to push back a little against that too.
Is there anything being said about community benefit from windmills? At one stage, some parishes got a nice payback from a windmill. Others missed out completely. What's the score going forward?
So, Chair, that's not something that's raised through this consultation specifically, because it's always been something that sits outside of the planning system in terms of those direct community benefits. That's a matter around the tests for planning obligations that need to be directly related in scale and kind and necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms are the two main ones there. Now, giving money to a community for improvements not directly related to the impact of that development isn't something that's really enabled through the planning system at the moment. So the government is aware of that, and I understand that the previous government was exploring mechanisms to secure community benefits, but not directly through this consultation. It isn't raised.
Is there an opportunity for us to remind them to do it?
We can certainly do that. I'm sure we can find a question to slot that into.
Yeah, I see heads nodding.
But,
Yep.
yeah,
Councillor Hames.
there has been, amongst the comments on these proposals, that this, including a community-based benefit in renewable energy as part of development, should be part of the consideration under these revisions. So I think we should, as Councillor Hicks says, we should be emphasising that.
Yeah.
On the number 78 in the proposals about what specific ways do we suggest to address climate change, I'm rather disappointed that we haven't put in that there should be some sort of target or requirement, rather, to reduce carbon emissions to a certain level within developments, as I've mentioned before, that other authorities have done. I can't see in the comments here that this has been made explicit, really. There's been reference to carbon accounting. Is that something related? Is that related to this? And is that the meaning of what you put here, carbon accounting, to determine what's a reduction of carbon emissions? Is that how it works?
Yeah, so that's the purpose of the carbon accounting. So the government is asking one of the questions, specific questions around the consultation, is around what can the government do to support carbon accounting effectively through local plans, and that's about understanding what the impacts of your local plan would be measured as in terms of carbon, in terms of and we raise some concerns around tools being available, the consistency of application of those tools, and also about making sure that planners are educated, and others, developers, etc., are educated in the use of that to understand the principles of that carbon accounting. And actually there's probably a gap there at the moment around that aspect of it. So we do raise concerns around that. We certainly can see the logic in supporting that, and there's certainly that direction of travel, as you say, in understanding the carbon impacts of development.
You don't make it explicit in your response. In your response in 78, you don't make it explicit that you recommend a carbon accounting system for developments or whatever. I would urge that we could do that. It's something that's been raised before, isn't it?
Yeah,
and it was part of our housing strategy, for instance. Presumably, I was going to raise that. Presumably, we were referring to the housing strategy results that we had recently. We're going to bear those in mind in our responses as well.
Yeah, on that, Councillor Hames, I think we can strengthen sort of the middle sentence within question 70. I think it talks broadly around policies looking at renewable energy on all developments and redevelopments. So we can emphasise that to a greater extent.
Yeah.
Councillor Walker.
Could we also add in encouraging existing developments, whether they be particularly places that have car parks, for instance, to utilise the solar power over car parks rather than putting it into the countryside.
Councillor Leather.
Thank you, Chair. And I agree with you. I think that solar so-called farms, seeing as they want to increase the capacity of them, in other words, increase the size of them, I don't see why over a certain level that there shouldn't be some local benefits from what, after all, people consider the industrialisation of the countryside. And over a certain level, I think there should be benefits for the local community from them. And I know it sits currently, as Ian has said and Helen said to me in the past, outside the planning, but it shouldn't do. Over a certain scale, I believe it should be considered and it should be offered, particularly with the increases in size. I mean, we're getting some huge schemes now of solar farms covering acres and acres of really good farmland in the end. And then on the other hand, nationally, we're told about producing more food in the country. And yet, there should be a balance there. But certainly, I've always believed, over a certain scale, local communities should benefit from these schemes. And they don't do as of a right.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you. Just for clarity, I think response 73 touches on solar panels over car parks. What I wanted to add to that was when we have housing developments, the social housing and the affordable housing is less likely to have solar PV than the market rate housing. I imagine it's a cost-cutting exercise, but it's the social housing and the affordable housing that's more likely to need the solar PV, and it has the maximum benefit. I think if we could just add that into our response on point 73, and just as an aside more on, I think around point 78, when we're talking about infrastructure, the most important thing for North Devon and for Torridge being an improved rail link, not simply the rail link from Barnstaple to Bideford, which is something of a dream we all have, but also the improvement from Barnstaple to Exeter, which is more achievable and would have benefit for the entire northern Devon area. If we could incorporate, I think as infrastructure, again, where I touched on it being a little bit London-centric in places, I think they're talking about public transport, but not thinking of the rail network because, well, they have one and we don't. But there are plenty of other parts of the country that really part of their infrastructure needs to touch on the importance of an improved rail connectivity to major cities, or Exeter, which is apparently a major city.
Councillor Hodson.
Thank you. Adding on to the comments by Councillor Bell, my concern was I attended a meeting last week where one of the major issues and concerns was getting children to college and the lack of bus services that met their needs. So when we're looking at transport, when we're looking at new developments and trying to encourage people not to have a car for every member of the family, but to utilise bus services, we've got to get smarter at this. And it really is critical that we actually say that we need, in Northern Devon, a much better infrastructure with bus routes. Because when we see new infrastructure plans coming out from at county level, are there very many routes being proposed around up here? There seem to be a distinct lack of new routes and new proposals. So we want to educate our children, we want to get them to school on time and college.
Councillor Walker.
Yeah, just to add an example to Councillor Hodson's very good point, try getting a child, young person from Howell Junction to North Devon Petrock in the morning. To get from Howell Junction to Petrock, you have to get a taxi to Holsworthy and then a bus to Barnstaple. Now that's completely mad. the buses just don't add up, and we need to think much more carefully about our bus infrastructure as well as our road infrastructure and proposition of new railways. And that's something that we had to deal with for a year and a half.
You are dead right. It's right through everywhere. Right, move on, Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully we're nearly there with some of these MPPF changes. There is a change around a footnote which talks about availability of agricultural land for food production. Now, they do talk about removing that emphasis on that food production directly within that footnote, which we're broadly supportive of, but we do really strongly emphasise the need that the government include references elsewhere with the MPPF to recognise the importance of food production and food security, and that's imperative. And also there are a question around, are there any other ways that we can support development to not compromise food production, highlighting the availability, highlighting the value of achieving multifunctional land use, continued prioritisation of protecting the best and most versatile agricultural land, but also highlight that it's not only that land that's important role to play in food production. So that there's always been this really emphasis on that best and most versatile, but actually it's wider than that. So we're asking for the government to recognise that.
Coupled with that, I would have liked to have seen allied industries to agriculture, because in practice in Torridge and North Devon there's a hell of a lot of people who are involved in agriculture, but they're not ploughing a furrow or milking a cow. And there's no provision made for them at all. Right, I think we can move on.
Chair, you'll be glad to know that we've got to the end of the MPPF revisions, broadly speaking. I'm going to hand over to Helen, who's just going to talk through the planning fees aspect of it.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, so the consultation does include a section on amendments to planning fees. This is at chapter 11 of the consultation, and it's specifically questions 89 to 102. The summary text supporting these questions highlights that it is widely recognised that current planning fees do not generate enough income to cover the cost of some planning applications, not all necessarily. Back in December 2023, there was an increase to planning application fees brought in by the government. So this was an increase of 35% for all major applications, and then an increase of 25% on all other applications. The consultation document indicates that despite these increases, there's still, and this is based on recent local government spending data, a shortfall of £262 million in terms of planning services. The consultation very much highlights the greatest shortfalls relating to the majority of application types that are received, and specifically householder applications are mentioned in the consultation. So specifically, you can see on the slide up on the screen now. So the questions are seeking views on the principle of moving to cost recovery on planning application services. There is a specific proposed increase for householder applications. At the moment, a householder application is £258. The calculated cost, and this is presumably averaged across the country, that is being put forward and suggested as a means of cost recovery is £528 for a householder application. There are further questions around whether fees should be introduced and or raised for other applications. So, for example, the draft response makes reference to the existing fees for prior notifications. So these are permitted development applications being too low. Although there's a lot of permitted development now, frequently our planning teams find that these are not straightforward applications. It certainly isn't necessarily a streamlining of the process. So these are often do not meet cost recovery. Section 73 applications as well. So this is where an applicant can come in to
amend or remove a planning condition. That fee is a set figure, and this can be done on sort of major applications, which the original fee would have been a significant amount of money. And there is a lot of work that does go into these applications, both from an administration point of view, but also the consideration of the principle, most notably with majors. There was discussion back in one of the earlier previous government consultations around increasing retrospective planning application fees, almost as a deterrent to unauthorised development. That never moved forward. I think the draft response that JPPC endorsed at that time did seek that it would be sensible to increase retrospective fees. So that's all highlighted in the draft response. Interestingly, the consultation poses a question around whether application fees should be increased to cover wider planning services, so going beyond cost recovery for determining planning applications. So, for example, should there be an uplift to fund enforcement services or even plan making? And then finally, there's questions around whether fees should be set nationally or whether councils should be able to set fees locally. The council's joint response is obviously set out as part of the agenda. So we just welcome any thoughts on what's before you in the current draft.
Right, Councillor Bell's going to fire off.
Thank you, Chair. Two little comments, if you don't mind. You mentioned tree preservation. I think the response is that we would like to see charges introduced, and I didn't realise that we weren't charging for tree preservation in the past, which is something. But I would suggest that if we started charging amounts for tree preservation, we could very quickly see a situation where trees fall down quite fast by themselves. Currently, people are encouraged, I would think, and I don't have big trees in my house, I would think people are encouraged to seek planning permission on tree preservation because it's a freebie. I would be quite scared of the idea of introducing at least anything more than a nominal charge. And I recognise how hard working the planning department is, so I don't want them doing anything for free because I have nothing but the greatest respect. But I would worry about that. And if you don't mind, just to come back to something that Councillor Hackett said earlier on self-builds, I would love to see our response go forward on something that would bring in a grant system for self-builds where individuals looking to self-build could apply for a grant to cover their planning costs, and then, or alternatively, a system where simply the planning is put through at their request, and at a point in the future, once that build is completed, then they are then charged. So essentially back paying by some distance. And again, I know that both these things are creating costs, but I think that would drive up self-build, and you'd have more people looking to self-build, because the first hurdle you hit with a self-build, or one of the first hurdles, is that planning charge before you've got a spade to your garage. Thank you.
Councillor Haynes.
Sorry, following up on TPOs. Sorry, can I clarify this? Are you suggesting that anyone who wants a TPO applies for TPO should be charged? Because I'm thinking of asking for TPOs somewhere at the moment. I'll certainly be dissuaded from doing so. I'm not quite sure what you mean.
I think it's more generally applications for works to trees that are subject to a TPO. And similarly with listed building applications, there isn't a fee currently for listed building consent. We can certainly temper the response to acknowledge we don't want the consequence to be people carrying out works without permission. But there is a cost to the service in administering those functions. So I absolutely note that. And I think Councillor Bell, on your self-build point, we can certainly bring something in around that. I think in fairness though, the fee itself combined with all of the other costs is minimal, but we can certainly put something in to acknowledge that and the encouragement around self-build. Yeah, noted.
Councillor Hodson.
Thank you. You mentioned whether we determine our planning fees locally or nationally. We need to be very cautious here, because if we find ourselves with higher planning fees than our neighbouring authorities, we may find, and it was mentioned right at the beginning of this building, whether we've got enough brickies and developers to actually develop all these properties, we may well find that if they can develop more cheaply in a neighbouring authority, that that's where they'll go. So I think we need to do a bit of research before we, I know it's not been determined yet how it will go, but whether a national charge might be more appropriate.
Really good point, Councillor Hodgson. I think the response does direct towards adopting a national approach. I think there's lots of reasons why a local approach is problematic, not least as you describe that discrepancy between different authorities. I think the additional, perhaps onerous then sort of administration of that, you'd have to evidence how you've reached your fee. And actually the consultation text is quite clear that it's almost local fees would come in if it's considered the nationally set ones aren't meeting your costs. But I think for us as a rural authority, if it's a national fee that's almost sort of averaging out costs, we should in theory find that that's an appropriate level if it's to meet cost recovery, but we'll certainly take that on board.
I think it's fairly hopeful to be aiming for full cost recovery. I remember when North Devon and Torridge both ran with the Chief Planning Officer and 2 Development Control Officers and charged nothing. Councillor Cottle-Hunkin.
Yeah, it's just going back to that question 89 about increasing that fee. And you've said at the end, particularly where the works are very minor, it's just that concern over whether we'll have fewer planning applications come in because people will think, well, I'm not going to spend 500, and they might have, if it stayed at 258, then they might have put it forward. But if it's now going to cost them 500 and something, they're not going to bother. And we hear concerns of enforcement over plannings, and they think, well, that doesn't really matter, that no one's going to make me change it. So I just worry that they're not going to put in those planning applications. So I don't think that we should be saying yes to 89. And in discussions that we've had with other councillors that don't sit on this committee, I thought that was what the overriding feeling was from councillors.
I think the question on 89 is around cost recovery primarily. And I think, you know, this is a joint council's response. So there is support for the principle of meeting cost recovery, I think, is set out there, but it is tempered, as for the reasons you raised, Councillor Cottle-Hunkin, around that impact on local communities and that disparity between, say, a large house extension and maybe just sort of wanting to change some windows. So I hopefully that does address that. And I think if councillors feel very strongly that there should be no increase or that it shouldn't be the aim to meet cost recovery, then it is of course open to any individual councillors to submit a comment as well if they feel they want to put that position across strongly.
I just was feeling that we're sitting here to represent other members of the council, and that was why I wanted to raise it, because that was what I felt their feeling was as a wider council.
Councillor Locke.
I mean, we seem to be getting more and more non-material amendments applications. Are there any set fees for that?
Yeah, there is a minor fee for a non-material amendment. Yeah.
So are they on to be increased, or are they going to stay the same?
We don't know. I mean, the only fee that's specifically indicated is the householder fee, and I think the reason for that, as the consultation explains, is that that generally is one of the majority type of applications that we received. Hence, the fact that that's so far off meeting cost recovery is having a big impact on council budgets. So, but you know, very aware certainly of some concerns around this were raised certainly at the Torridge Council session, but we are incorporating sort of the North Devon comments as well here that were provided across to us. So hopefully it's a balanced response.
Councillor Nather.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I agree. I don't agree that we should be increasing the householder application fee to that kind of a level, 500 odd pounds, 528 pounds. And as for cost recovery, yeah, we should, but I do think councils should set their own levels. I really do. As somebody who really believes in proper local democracy, that for me is it. Some councils are more efficient than others. I mean, why have we got a variety of council taxes being charged across Devon? We have, because councils run differently, and some are more efficient and some run things better. But I don't see why we shouldn't set our own fee level. It's a bit of a cop-out to let the government do it. Why should they? They base it on, they don't even look at the demographics of our area, being a poor area in the country. They lump us in with the rest of the countries if we can afford to pay all this money. I don't see why we shouldn't set our own fees. I would be all in favour of that.
Got a few hands. Right, Councillor Hackett.
Always remember that when a house is improved by planning, it can be revalued and you get increased council tax. And when we build these properties, we get council tax off them. So, yes, it might be a loss leader to have planning, but we recoup it in the long run.
Councillor Hames.
Referring to Councillor Cottle-Hunkin's comments just now, I thought at last session recently, was it on the local plan, that we were asked what we thought would be the right sort of figure, and I thought we stated that. Maybe I'm dreaming. I thought we did that.
Yeah, I don't think a figure was stated. I think there was concern around impact on local communities from increasing the fees. I don't recall a figure being suggested. Yeah, which is flagged up in the response, but yeah, we could strengthen that second part of the answer to question 89.
Councillor Prowse.
Chair, I think, you know, we've got to live in the real world. How much work do you expect your officers to do for a few hundred quid? I mean, it is the real, you know, in the real world. Very often householders are prepared to go and pay an agent 1,000 quid, 1,500 quid to get the application together, or a survey is £500 by the time, you know, a measured survey. So we've got to live in the real world, and, you know, they've got a budget for doing the job properly. And we want our officers to be able to have the chance to put the time to it. And if you're not recovering your costs, and they've got other major applications nagging them, you're only putting extra pressure financially on the council and on your officers. I think, you know, you either agree with the recovery of costs or you don't. And presumably the government's evidence has been sought from local authorities dealing with householder applications. So you can't just accept some of the principle. You either go with it or you don't. And, you know, I mean, perhaps I'm being naive, but certainly in the real world, people are quite happy to go and pay their architects, or architects with a small a sometimes, and other agents to do the work for them. I think they've just got a budget for the whole job, and so that it's dealt with properly. But
Councillor Warden.
Yeah, I quite agree with what Councillor Prowse has just said, because if we don't actually recover the costs here, it's got to come from somewhere on the council, and the pressure on our budgets for the whole of the council is extremely high. And you know, it seems to me the principle of recovering costs is what we should be going for. So I think the way that it's been written is absolutely spot on. So I'm happy with what's there.
Councillor Cottle-Hunkin.
I think in the real world we'll see more planning alterations without planning permission.
I'm sorry, that's
a different matter.
That may be, but, you know, no.
Yes, Ken. You've been very quiet today.
No. And the only point I wanted to make was that across the whole local government sector, local authorities, district councils, local planning authorities have been raising this issue about cost recovery in relation to planning fees for years. And we have finally got some traction through the LGA, through the district councils network, and that's resulted in this consultation. So I think if you look across the sector, there would be broad support for cost recovery on planning application fees. And the evidence that's been put forward by district councils does not suggest that there would be an increase in unauthorised development as a result of it. That's not the opinion that's been put forward. So, you know, if it, you know, as we've said, you know, I know we're talking here as a planning policy committee, but certainly I think corporately, I would imagine that both councils, when they're looking at their financial position, would support cost recovery.
Councillor Walker.
By not providing full cost recovery, basically every other council taxpayer who doesn't want an extension on their property is subsidising those who do. And I mean, £500 may seem a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, when you're building an extension, I mean, we'd like to build an extension on our bungalow at the moment. The cost we've been given for it is about £90,000. £500 as a proportion of that 90,000 build is minimal. And I think our planning departments need to pay for themselves. Otherwise, people who look at budgets are going to turn around and say, well, why am I paying for somebody else's extension? And being one of the people who has to help make the budget balance in North Devon, I'm fully in favour of recovering costs.
Councillor Leather.
Well, you can say that about any cost in the council. You could break any item in the council off and say, why should I pay for this? I don't have that service, I don't use that. And cost recovery, yeah, I do agree with cost recovery, but my point is we should be setting our own costs. And I don't accept this that, well, maybe, as Councillor Hodgson said, West Devon and Mid Devon might be charging differently. Well, that'd be up to them. But I haven't got a clue what household application does cost our officers. I've never been given any evidence what that is. And it will vary from council to council. My point is, yeah, cost recovery by all means, but we should set the fees, not central government.
It looks to me like we're nicely split down the middle. Is the document that's written about split down the middle? Probably is, just about, isn't it?
I would say it's as balanced as it can be. I think there certainly seems to be agreement around the principle of supporting cost recovery. How that's done, maybe, and to what extent is the slight differing of opinion. There is reference in here to potentially, well, further encouraging again, looking at retrospective fees to potentially double those. So the concern around works being undertaken due to the higher planning application fee, or potentially they would have to pay double if it went through an enforcement case. So I think we've really tried to capture everything members have said, but as the chair has just highlighted, there are some differing views here. But I feel it's as balanced, and where we can strengthen things, we will of course do that.
I think that's your best solution in the circumstances. Drive on.
I'd say, Chairman, as a declaration, as you did mention about listed building applications being free. And it's a bit back to that TPO argument too, isn't it? Because I live in a listed house, and it's something that's imposed on you, like a TPO is imposed on the owner of the tree. So there are certain differences there, as opposed to, because when you come to a listed house, if you want to do anything, energy efficient wise, you need planning permission for it, and so there are some issues there around owners of listed buildings and owners of trees with TPOs.
But when you come to sell it, you make a big song and dance about being a listed building. You can go round in circles, Malcolm.
I'm talking about selling it, Chair. I'm talking about trying to live in it.
Councillor Cottle-Huntry.
Just adding to that listed building fee, whether we should mention in there about community-owned listed buildings, whether they could be separate from that fee, if it's to the benefit of the community. Yeah. I think declaring interest, like the redundant church we've got in Petrock, so we're looking at ways to protect it for the community. So I would say that then maybe that could be exempt from planning.
Yeah, we can certainly add that in. I think that's a good suggestion. We've moved on to the next slide now. Now, as part of the planning fee questions, there are a few questions at the end around the ability for local authorities to recover costs for their involvement in NSIP, so nationally significant infrastructure projects. Now, Torridge, we're involved in our first NSIP, the X-Links project, so have very sort of relevant experience, which I think, you know, from our experience to date, it is a lot of work that it puts onto council planning services and other parts of the council service. It's not something we receive a fee for because we're not a determining authority. At the moment, it's very much whether the applicant is willing to engage in a planning performance agreement to enable cost recovery. Fortunately on the X-Links project, we have secured that, but the response, the draft response you have before you is very much supporting the principle of introducing cost recovery for these development consent orders that do require a lot of council resource, certainly post submission of the development consent order and throughout the examination process, and also the need for external specialist advice. We don't have in-house ecologists or landscape experts, so we, through the X-Links project, have sought to secure those costs to be covered, and indeed sort of specialist legal advice, for example. So I think the response does look
I
for
think
that.
you're going into X-Links in detail. I act for landowners affected by X-Links. I think I need to declare an interest, and I'll leave the room whilst you do. Malcolm, you're stuck with it.
I think we're just citing it as an example because the answers requested an example to be set out, so it's giving that context. But I think the suggested response very much supports the intent of cost recovery. So I don't think you necessarily need to leave, Chair.
Okay.
Chair, I think this highlights that when we start talking about community benefit payments coming in, we want a good hit out of anything where this is involved. I'm not mentioning any particular scheme at all.
And I'll just say on the other points that are on the slide, I think Ian's already covered those on the previous slide. So it's whether there's any further thoughts specifically around cost recovery for the development consent order process.
When you say adjusting thresholds on solar, for a big solar farm now, it goes on the acreage, it's a big fee. You're not thinking of reducing it, are you?
So the government was suggesting increasing the threshold for NSIPs up to 150 megawatts from 50 megawatts. So in fact, that local authorities would have larger solar farms to deal with locally than we would have before. So the trigger of the transition between being a planning application and a development consent order through the NSIP regime would increase threefold is their proposal.
So you get better fee, yep. That's okay. Drive on.
Yeah, so the final section is around transitional arrangements for plan making. So they recognise that this will have an impact, and the introduction of a new NPPF, a new standard method, would have an impact on those that are preparing their local plans. And it seeks views on the range of proposals they've set out. In reality, those proposals are focused on those that have reached their Regulation 19 stage, which is the publication of their plan, their finished plan that they feel is ready to be tested and examined, or for those that are already examination. They don't have any arrangements in the transitional proposals to mitigate impacts of the introduction of that new standard method or the wider NPPF proposals for those that are at earlier stages of preparation of their plans at Regulation 18, which we have called issues and options before, or at an earlier stage such as we find ourselves at. There's also no transitional arrangements provided for decision-taking, such as what we've talked about earlier, and the impact that the introduction of the standard method could have on the presumption in favour of sustainable development. So we've raised concerns that there are no transitional arrangements that would benefit us as local planning authorities, concerns that could undermine the plan-led system, that we've got an up-to-date local plan in place, that it's robust. We're in the top 30% of most recently adopted plans, and we seem to be penalised on that basis, that our plan may be overnight considered out of date for certain decisions. So we've raised all of those concerns. We've also raised concerns around the sort of pushback of the introduction of the new planning system, the new plan-making system. They're talking now summer, autumn of 2025, rather than autumn 2024. We were expecting to be able to start under the new system as of now, and that we've just highlighted that we are keen to progress with our plan, that we see that that's really important for Northern Devon, and that we would still like to be a front runner in terms of those new plan making system. And that the deadline, the cut-off for preparing a plan under the old system was pushed forward to December 2026, again isn't of value to us, because it's going to take us longer than that to get a plan in place. So we wouldn't be able to take advantage of that and plan under the existing plan-making system. So those are the type of messages that we're putting forward, that we don't think that the transitional arrangements are broad enough, don't give enough support to authorities such as ourselves, and our concerns around that there's no arrangements for decision-taking, i.e. falling off a cliff in terms of our housing numbers. I'll leave it there, Chair.
I think there's nothing more to be added. You've said what the only thing you can say. Yep, move on.
So, Chair, we move on to the recommendations in the report. I've put those up on the screen for you. It was around considering the draft response to the consultation and then endorsing the response to be formally submitted on behalf of the two councils. I would suggest that you may wish to amend that second recommendation to incorporate the comments that have been received today, and thus make amendments on that basis.
Yep, can somebody propose that, please? Councillor Leather, seconded by Councillor Bell. All those in favour? That is unanimous. Thank you.
Before you move on,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to say a big thank you to the officers for all the hard work that they've done on this. It's been an excellent report and a very good discussion today, and I think that needs to be recorded as a big thank you from all us members for what the officers have done producing.
I think many of the critics of the JPPC ought to have been here to see it, but there we are. Item 8, review of the local plan review project initiation document. You're going to deal with that one, madam.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Chair. And just quickly picking up on Councillor Warden's acknowledgement then, I think it's just to say there's a lot of officers that fed into this response, many of whom aren't here across both councils. So it was a good joint council team effort. Yes, so I'm just going to run through the report and associated update to the local plan project initiation document. So the report and associated appendix are set out at pages 64 to 73 of your agenda. So as you're all more than aware, plan making, preparing a local plan is incredibly complex and a lengthy process. Officers have sort of presented before on the PID, as we call it, recognising it's important that there's a robust project management tool and project initiation documents. The PID provides the basis for managing the local plan as a project. So back in March, at the last meeting of JPPC, you endorsed a version of the PID that was considered appropriate at that time. And as you're aware, since that time there have been a range of matters that have had a bearing on this programme, not least the change in government, which impacted on the introduction of the anticipated plan making, the national plan making reforms. The LURA was enacted back in October of 2023, so that was the primary legislation. We were expecting the secondary legislation to come out over the course of this year, which would have confirmed the new plan making procedures, with us potentially of being able to get on with a new plan in November of this year. Waves were suggested at the time, and you'll recall that as jointly as councils we put forward that we would wish for our local plan to be a front runner and to have the opportunity to move forward with a new local plan at the earliest opportunity. Ian has just sort of covered the concerns and the issues that have come up now with the new consultation and the proposed transitional arrangements and the uncertainty that we now find ourselves upon again. There's reference to the sort of new plan making coming in from sort of summer, autumn of 2025, that if you're currently working on a local plan to continue to do so, but there is a requirement for submission by December 2026. Now the report before you sort of highlights that would give sort of barely 27 months to get to that point, which is unachievable from your officer's point of view. And we are still waiting on these further details, so the further clarification as to what plan making will look like. Equally, the MPPF draft talks about continuing to progress to a new plan without delay, so there are some tensions there. There's further uncertainties as well. We are awaiting national development management policies, which will of course have a bearing on our new local plan. This we were hoping would be towards the end of the year, but it's possibly pushed back into next year. We can't be certain. Again, we're waiting confirmation of the approach and the regulations associated with plan making. The new MPPF will potentially be out and published by the end of this year. And also, most notably, as raised by Ian earlier, the changes to the standard method for calculating housing, which obviously has a big implication for our local plan making. That all said, I mean, the initial programme of work, which is set out at Appendix A in your Appendix 1, sorry, in your report, has been updated to reflect where we are in these changes. But broadly speaking, officers are recommending that the current approach is the right one. Just looking at the appendix now, some key elements of work that have been done. So the member thematic working groups have been set up and inception meetings have happened. The assessment and scoping of evidence. Now this is perhaps one of the trickiest areas, and this is ongoing, that with uncertainties around certain things such as the standard method, what our housing numbers are going to look like, it's very difficult to be commissioning those housing related pieces of evidence. However, there are certain things that we can continue to do. Just moving over to the next page, key work that we very much agreed, and certainly JPPC agreed, is to look at the engagement and consultation strategy, and importantly this visioning and scoping stage, which I think we still very much find ourselves within. So the updated position as of September 2024 suggests that that visioning and scoping taking place between September 24 and April 2025, and that includes whole councillor workshops and engagements, work with our town and parish councils, and scoping strategies coming out of that. So this is all work that we can and should, in your officer's view, be getting on with. The duty to cooperate is ongoing. There have been meetings taking place, most notably with Exmoor, Somerset and Cornwall councils as our neighbours. There's some uncertainty around design codes as highlighted in the MPPF consultation. The HELA is ongoing. I think the next HELA panel meeting is due to take place on the 28th of October. And the ongoing work with coastal change management and fluvial change risk management is also continuing. So I think ultimately what the recommendation of the report before you is to note the updated national plan making context. I think we've sort of discussed that in quite a lot of detail today. And then the associated impacts on the preparation of a new local plan for Northern Devon, to reaffirm the commitment to preparing a new local plan for Northern Devon under the proposed new plan making system, recognising the dates as stated in the consultation would prohibit us from being ready for submission by December 2026. And finally, to endorse the revised initial programme of work that is intended to be carried out over the coming months and in advance of the formal commencement of plan making. Thank you, Chair.
Very clear, with very little alternative, is my opinion, but Councillor Leather wants to speak.
Well, just to say that, yeah, thanks for that, Helen. There is plenty that we can do between now and next summer, which will not be wasted work at all, whatever the government of the day come up with as a preferred plan making policy. So, yeah, I'm happy to move those recommendations, Chair.
Councillor Bell.
I would have two questions, if that's okay. Can I just ask, and obviously this will be a guesstimate, but the level of confidence that the HELA is going to meet the updated targets? I mean, pick a number out of the air, but do you feel confident we're going to make it, or are you apprehensive? I really at that scale.
This is in fact something we discussed only yesterday, is whether or not one of the options may be that we need to reopen the call for sites to supplement and complement the level of sites that we've had come in so far. I think there could be a real sense in doing so. We've got the potential, we've got the time and the scope to do that. And it may be that we need to open that up for the uses as well, community uses, renewable energy uses, various other aspects too, green BNG, biodiversity net gain. We could open it up, the call for sites, for various uses, but we need to explore that. So I think the answer is my confidence isn't there isn't a certainty that we've got sufficient land or sufficient choice of land there.
And just on traveller accommodation,
Press my little button. We're pausing traveller accommodation search at the moment. Will we get moving on that again shortly?
Yeah, so to traveller accommodation, it's more to do with, there's been some real uncertainty around the definition of travellers at the national level in terms of toing and froing between those that have permanently or temporarily ceased travelling. We need just some guidance and some clarity and certainty on that, really, before we move forward on commissioning evidence that would be predicated on what our population looks like. So we just need to make sure that we're doing that at the right moment, I think. And certainly we could introduce that to the call for sites as well, if we were to reopen that.
Thank you.
Councillor Prowse.
Chair, the HELA panel tends to be responsive to sites, and they vary in size. And I think that it highlights that the figures that it ain't going to do the job, is what I'm saying, on its own. You can call for sites, and it probably unlikely even then to fill the sort of numbers we're talking about. So I think the important thing from today too is that we ought to get on of our joint visioning session between both councils, because heard about a new town at Broadwood, we've heard about a new settlement in Bideford and Barnstable. You know, there are options about larger urban extensions, or whether we look at villages, look at local centres, the bigger villages. You know, those are the sort of things I think we've got to get together and lead on, rather than just have landowners throw in and sites. So the HELA can carry on, it can call for more sites, but I think we've got to get a bit of an idea, because even if those figures come down a bit, they're not going to come down hugely, are they? You know, we are going to be faced with these big numbers. So the sooner we get together and get a broad outline of how we think we can get near those figures, it'll probably have to be a mix and match of all those things in the end. But, you know, I would urge us to, you know, get a date if we can between us in October, right time to do it now. And we've got that bit of space, actually, with these delays in the formal process, to get that vision together to produce a decent bit of work, like an issues and options type document, while the HELA process carries on, Chair. So that's what and it may be sensible to have that recommendation as a on the, you know, that we get together our visioning day so that we can tackle those difficult issues together, you know, at an early stage now.
Councillor Hodgson.
Thank you. I fully endorse Councillor Prowse's proposal there. My question is, we've found it impractical to try and hit the target of date-wise of delivery of this, but we have got now no definitive or estimated timeline. Now, will this become, I know it's subject to all the other things that are happening, but I am concerned, I wasn't on the council when you developed the last local plan, but I'm led to believe it took many years. So are we, and one of the key things about this, going ahead and getting it done before the election was called and everything changed, was we were actually going to operate to a much tighter timeline and be much more focused in our approach. Are we opening the doors to a very protracted process again, or are we going to keep our fingers on the pulse to keep this delivered in a reasonable period of time?
Chair, I can come back if you like.
Three of us prepared to have a go, I think. Go on, Ian. I'll talk.
So I think the answer is, yeah, we're all committed to making sure we're delivering on this, and that we recognise that we need to get a timeline in as soon as we've got enough certainty to do so.
Okay.
I think the big question at the moment is, when will that new plan making system come in? And if hopefully it will be giving us a prescribed timeline in that sense. 30 months was what was previously suggested. That will give us the clarity, that will give us that direction, and it will give us an end date effectively to work with. So we are all committed to that, and we're wanting to make sure we push this forward. And it's for you as a JPPC to keep us in check on that and make sure we're doing what we're meant to be doing.
Is that a dodging the bullet?
Thank you. Thank you for that confirmation, but I thought it was something that this committee needs to sort of sign up to and make sure that, yes, we are the driving force. You're the deliverers of all the hard work, I know, but we need to be reassuring our other members in our local authorities who are concerned that this has got to go forward at the best possible speed. So thank you.
Just to add to Ian's response, so para 416 of your report, it does commit at the end that this will all be kept under review. No, I think it's very valid what you've raised, Councillor Hodgson, but it does say a detailed programme will be drawn up and presented to members of this committee as soon as reasonably practicable, as and when that national context allows. So I think we very much recognise that the PID that's before you today is almost an interim, recognising the level of uncertainty, but we would look to prepare that detailed programme as soon as we can, and with regard to what that plan making regime looks like. But as Ian said, it was talking about 30 months, so we will bring that back as and when.
Chair.
Councillor Hames.
Yeah, on Councillor Prowse's point about the need to prepare a vision, I mean, the elements of that were covered at our recent Torridge local plan workshop, where we looked at site areas we thought might be suitable. We talked about new town developments, etc. So presumably that same exercise went on at North Devon. So at some point we need to get together, don't we?
Chair, can I formally move those three and add that fourth one on the workshop? So
Yep, moved, seconded. Thank you. Those in favour, please show. That is unanimous. And that brings us to the end of our agenda at 12:20.
Chair, are we going to agree a date?
For the engagement session. Yeah, we're just waiting.